Hi, this is Mark Payne here from the UK. I've just finished building an early release Schumacher Eclipse E6 kit. I'm preparing for the Chesterfield National. We're in January 2025 and I'm going to take you through the main improvements of the E6 platform. Let's get into it. So a bit of a disclaimer, I make this independent of Schumacher. I am sponsored by them to drive in the UK. They certainly don't sponsor me because I'm mega quick. I'm now midfield and at age 61 I find that I'm getting slower every year. Luckily the car is really looking after me, and since changing to the platform I think I've managed to prevent my continued decay. I've been racing 12 scale cars ever since about 1978, which was the beginning of 12 scale. My first car was a electric car, which were made in Leicestershire actually, which is near where I lived. I first met Cecil Schumacher and also Robin Schumacher. Back then Robin was a kid, I was a kid, he now runs Schumacher, and I'm retired but I'm still racing. In fact I did find a Schumacher XL Lexan chassis, which I used to race when I raced for Schumacher back then, and this would have been from the early 80s. I'm not sure, maybe 83, 84, something like that, but you might want to correct me in the comments. Just before I swapped over to the Eclipse I was running automatics, and I was one of the 3 people in the UK that introduced automatics. So I had quite a lot of experience on that car also. So firstly we're going to go into the suspension and have a good look at the front end. This is a brand new design which has got the spring internally and new precise damping and super smooth action. Number 2, we're going to look at the design of the new rear axle. It's super true and really well engineered. Thirdly, we'll look at the pod. Some things have stayed the same, but pod balance has changed slightly. So the fourth thing to discuss will be a little bit of detail on the side springs and how they've improved the spring carriers. Fifth, we'll look at some subtle changes to the side dampers. And number 6, we'll look at a slight change to the front bumper. Finally, we'll go over the whole car and talk about what parts are in common with the E5 and what parts are unique to the E6 platform. Okay, so firstly, let's just say in review of the car, the platform is very similar. The geometry of the car is very similar. There are some options on the front end that we'll get into, which are new developments, but the basic layout of the car is pretty much identical to the E5. The chassis plate is the same chassis plate as used on the E5, so if you're carrying a spare of that, it's going to be still useful to you. This platform has proved highly durable and actually highly copyable. You'll be aware of other manufacturers that have taken Andy Murray's original ideas for the Eclipse platform and pretty much done a carbon copy of it. Tweakless front end, really strong tweakless rear pod, a chassis that goes all the way back. There is no spring in the center, the spring is at the back of the car. The thing doesn't fold in the middle. It's really stable over bumps. It's really good in lower medium grip, and we've got new things going on with the front end that are going to improve its performance in high grip. So probably the biggest change to the car, I would say, would be the front end design. It's a pretty special thing. We've got a aluminium hub which has a steel axle piece which attaches to it, or rather is threaded into it. Now these pieces aren't handed, so what goes on the left hand side and the right hand side is exactly the same, so you don't have to buy a left hand and a right hand hub. You could basically assemble these out of the aluminium piece and the axle, which can go either way round. It's basically the same piece, so that's a really great design feature. And the most surprising thing, as you can probably see, you don't see a spring, because the spring is completely contained within the hub. And it's a longer spring than we've been used to using, and a slightly higher diameter spring, so it's more accurate. It will allow more travel. It's more, I'm not going to use the word progressive because that would be the wrong word, but it's a smoother, more predictable action and will allow for more suspension travel. The first thing, let's just talk about the front beam. It's basically the same front beam as on the E5. There are a couple of extra holes which I'm not wholly sure what they're going to be for yet. Don't know. I did ask Andy, and I'm not sure that he wanted to tell me, but he's got a future idea for this hole here, which I'll just show you. It's this one here. That's not on an E5. Other than that, the centers are exactly the same. So the kingpin spacing is the same. The dimensions and how it attaches to the chassis is the same. So I've stripped these off. If I show you in a bit more detail here, you can see that there's an aluminium hub outer, and then this steel piece here which forms the axle. The axle is 4mm, so that's gone up from 1/8, so it's a bigger, stronger axle. And then inside there's a kingpin outer. There's a kingpin inner which sits on the beam, and that's steel. That slides over it, and that's your suspension there. So this piece here, which is the outer of the kingpin, is super smooth. It's hard coated, and it's running on little bushings, which I'm going to strip this down for you. So this is split down into its components. We've got the hub itself, which is got a little recess in there, and what's going in there first of all is an O-ring. Now you don't have to put the O-ring in, but for now I'm going to be using it. The O-ring's gone in, and then optionally, and I have used it on these, there's a little 0.1 shim, and I'm going to drop that in because that just gives a little bit of more O-ring pressure, and the O-ring therefore will just have a little bit more damping. Now we're using a Core RC set of damping fluids. This is a bit of a sample that I've been given because we're still waiting for those to come in, but there's a green one which is kind of medium, and a yellow one which is lighter, and I'm using the yellow one at the moment. So we've got the O-ring that's gone in there, then that little 0.1 washer just to give it a little bit more O-ring pressure for a bit more damping. Then there's this PTFE impregnated collar, which is basically a bush that the shaft's going to ride on. And by the way, that's steps, so it locates, but there's no top and bottom to this, so it doesn't matter which way around you put that in. And then there's a collar that goes on. You can do that up reasonably tightly. What I like about it is it doesn't deform the bush. I've had problems that before with other manufacturers. Effectively that forms part of the arrangement of damping, which is basically being provided by a mixture of the grease that you're using and also the O-ring or not an O-ring, and how much pressure you've put on the O-ring with the washer or not use the washer. Then the next thing that happens is there's a couple of preload washers. I've put 3 in. These are 0.2, so I've put 0.6, in my case 0.6 of preload in there, and then the spring goes on. It's quite clever, this is. I'm just to see if I can show you in detail. There's a very small step. It's about there, maybe, you know, it lasts for about 2mm, and it locates the spring so that the spring's held, and therefore there'll be a gap all around the spring and the shaft, so the spring won't be rubbing on the shaft. And more than that, as you insert it into the hub, push it through the O-ring, so that's its spring action there, the actual hub itself is conical and holds the spring centrally in the hub, so the spring can't touch the outside of the hub because it's been centered, and it can't touch the shaft because it's been centered away from the shaft. So it means that the shaft's going up and down without actually rubbing on the spring at all, which is very cool. And then effectively the next thing, the last thing that goes in, is the top bearing surface, this PTFE impregnated running surface, and then the last collar goes on. And then you have ended up with this internally springed shock absorber, effectively. I can put these two together and see quite accurately that they're exactly the same feel. You can see they're both depressing at exactly the same rate, and they touch together in that even if I go quickly, the damping would appear to be the same viscosity. So that's a really predictable assembly. It is a different camber strap used on the E6. Although the lower beam from an E5 would fit, the camber strap won't, because the diameter of the kingpin is just slightly different. You can adjust the front droop by putting small washers on the kingpin at the bottom, which will reduce the amount of free play. I've got about 0.4 of a mil of front droop. Obviously the smoothness of the damping and the springing on the kingpins is a completely different story. It's an advanced, much more advanced kind of front end design, but the geometry is similar to E5. And a Schumacher car, part of its, I think, its secret to success is that it has quite a lot of scrub. So what I mean by scrub is the distance from the kingpin centre to the position of the inner bearing, if you like, on the front wheel is quite large. So the wheel's going through quite a large arc, so it kind of amplifies the caster that's on the car. And I think the front end of this car works really well. It's easy to drive, it feels really nice and smooth, and also it's really good in low to medium grip. Now you could argue that a high grip, with really high grip like we get in the States, I mean I don't race in the States, but on CRC carpet, the black carpet where they're having to glue the shoulders of the tyres and stuff, you could argue that you don't want so much of that. The geometry only matches the E5 if you've got this little 1mm washer in place, and the idea is that if you're running on super high grip, you might want to use the optional front beam, which is just slightly wider, and you remove the 1mm washer here, and then you'll end up with a front end which has got a wider spacing between the kingpins and less scrub. If you're in Europe running on ETS carpet, which is medium high grip, maybe both would be suitable, and you need to find out which front end you like. But I think the idea is for most of our UK tracks, which we would identify as being medium or medium low grip, we're going to be using the standard E5, if you like, geometry, which is the kit setting on the new E6. Whereas you go to ETS, or certainly on the CRC carpets, then you've got the option to go for a much more reduced scrub with less jacking on the front end of the car, because it'll have less caster amplification. The car's weighted up, it's on its rear tyres, there's just a little bit of droop, probably that much. I mean, it's tiny, probably about 0.5 mm, which is about where I like it. And if I felt I wanted to take some of that droop out, I could introduce the these are 0.2 mil shims, which would go underneath between the bottom of the kingpin and the hub itself. Now also, you don't have to blueprint it either, because some of the issues with this is, you know, you've got to polish your kingpins, you've got to make sure that you've got good tolerances on your plastic components, you've got to be very careful that you don't over tighten that nut which holds the axle in, because if you squeeze that up, it distorts the shape of the plastic, and then that makes that bind on here. And in a run, you know, does this stay consistent? The advantage of the new front end is that because all of the components are effectively inside, the kingpin stays clean. There's an O-ring stopping stuff, for oil or grease or whatever you're using, falling out the bottom, and you end up with a really clean kingpin, and it's going to stay consistent through the run, and it's going to stay consistent through the meeting. So your rebuild time between rebuild is going to be much less, and it's much more consistent there. We've got a whole new set of new springs for the car. Obviously they need to be new springs because they're slightly wider diameter and they're slightly longer, so it's a higher performance spring which is available. I've gone a little bit softer than the kit setting, as I actually do with the E5 as well, but we'll get the full set of springs very soon. The way we change ride height hasn't changed. it's the shims underneath the front beam, as it's always been. Please don't get into thinking that every time you want to change ride height you're going to have to be tweaking around with the hub. It's just not the case. You just change ride height in the same way as you always have. See, we've gone for a stronger 4mm axle, and so we've got a slightly larger bearing. You can feel that the steering is a lot more positive. There's a lot less shake in the camber and caster. It's a really solid arrangement. So a unique design. Is really not copying anybody. Nobody else has put a spring inside there. I think it's absolutely fantastic. So let's go on to look at the rear end. One of the main things about the rear end is the change to this axle. The axle is effectively much improved. We're still using eccentrics to, you know, set the ride height, which I actually really like. I'm not a big lover of you know, the kind of axle tube thing and the shims you put in to raise that up and down. I actually really like the traditional inserts. I think they also protect the bearings very well. And this piece, the hub, the clamping hub, the split goes all the way through the hub. So it now clamps with much less pressure and it doesn't deform and run out of true. The thread that bolts the wheel on is actually floating. I need my other glasses for this. Problem with age. It's good that it doesn't want to come out. It's not going to drop out. You can see there's an O-ring there which locates or holds this. It's almost like an outdrive, and you see that that's floating. That pops in, falls through, then you rotate it round until it locates. The easiest way I've found is pop it on the axle. The external thread can't be pushed back in, and then you can pop your O-ring back in, pop it over the little collar in the shaft so that it sits in its intended groove. You should see that. That's really precise. The standard width, the widest width if you like, 171.5.6, and that's 172 if you like is the maximum, and that's achieved with 3 shims on each side, so it's a symmetrical setup. You don't really need much pressure now to tighten this up because the split is in the whole thing. As soon as you offer some kind of tension, it really is clamped up hard. And so yeah, we've got 3 shims here. We've also got 3 shims there. You put the shim on the outside of the spur gear because then you're not changing the position of the spur gear. You're only widening the position of the hub. If you take the shims out, you'd be down at 168.5 up to whatever width you like, a maximum of 172. This is a freshly trued rear tyre. It's kind of an interference fit on here. You just need to push it on. And I'm not even going to put the bolt on, but look. It is, even without the bolt, it's super true. It's going to be really durable. That is damn perfect. And the balance of the axle is just perfect. So it's a piece of genius. I really like it. The bulkheads, so the motor side and the other side, are exactly the same as E5. So if you've got spare bulkheads, keep them because you can use them on this car. I haven't changed the bulkheads. That's all good. What we have changed is the carbon. So the whole arrangement has shifted motor side by 0.75 of a mil. We've gone that way, and that's improved the pod balance. It's perfectly balanced for a hobby wing G4R motor, which is the motor which most people are using in the UK right now for spec classes for the 13.5 class. You put that motor in, standard pod setup, it's perfectly balanced, and I've tested that. It's bang on, okay, because I'm a bit pedantic about that. The other thing I just wanted to say, which hallelujah, is that the position of the spur gear has moved towards the motor by about 3mm. So I used to get really annoyed that I used to feel like I was putting a pinion right on the end of the shaft. You can see that there's plenty of shaft in that. Pinion's closer to the motor bearing. It's going to be truer. I like it. There's also a nice little change to the seat here. I use feeler gauges to set this distance here, so that's much easier to do. And if you're that way inclined, because that carbon's been changed there, you can get a set of feeler gauges in between here and here, which was difficult to do before. I've had it on the scales. By the time you finish with the axle and a few other lightning things that are going on, you know, if you're interested, there's no longer a step in this piece of carbon. They've used a slightly thinner piece of carbon overall, so that part isn't ground anymore. It's overall lighter. There's a bit of weight been taken out of the damper plate as well, and with the weight out of the axle, it's about 3 or 4 grams lighter. So a stronger axle, a truer axle, a clever piece of engineering, and a symmetrical axle which requires the same number of shims both sides, and a rebalance pod. It's all good news. So our fourth little change, and it's subtle but I like it, is the spring carrier. The spring carrier is slightly lower profile, which means that there's more room for the spring to sit in there. So I used to space up the tweak plate by about 0.5 millimeter to give me a little bit more room for the spring, so that I could properly unload the spring. In my opinion, you get the most consistent, stable car if the springs are only just touching. I'm not now needing to shim out that tweak bar. The damper bar, the tweak bar, damper bar, whatever you want to call it, that's exactly the same part as on an E5. So with your E5, if you've got a spare one of those, that's going to go straight across also. So item 5 on the list is the bumper. It's changed slightly in the, well, the first thing is it's secured with 3 holes now. Now you might think, well, there's only 2 holes before they changed the chassis, but no, the 3rd hole was always in the chassis. It's the same chassis, so it's mounted in 3 places. I think that's going to be stronger. And the other main change though is that you've got this little cutout which they supply it with an insert, so that you can, from an aero point of view, either have that in, and it obviously will need securing in there with a bit of glue or whatever, or you can pop it out. I just don't know what that's going to do. Do you know what that's going to do? Comments in. Obviously less pressure underneath, more airflow, maybe it's more steering, maybe it's less steering. I haven't tested this yet, so let's find out. But I quite like the fact that is an option. Pretty cool. I need to mention dampers. So the side damper bore is just slightly smaller, so that takes the reservoir of fluid, if you like, and the idea is to stop them from leaking so much, but enough to keep the damping renewed. The damping shouldn't be any different whether you use an E5 or an E6 damper, because effectively the damper is all about the weight of the oil and the tolerance between the inner piston and the outer damper tube. So it's between the inner piston and the outer damper tube and the oil that you use. The middle damper is still the original larger bore size. So when you build the kit, just be careful that you don't mix up the 2 side dampers and the center one. So we were talking about parts that will transfer across. Optionally the bumper, although it's a slightly different bumper design, but the dimensions are exactly the same. You could use an E5 lower beam, although the new one has got a couple of holes for a reason I don't know yet. And remember, we do have the wider optional beam that will be available as well. It's the same servo saver arrangement, which is the Kimbra wide space servo. Which I think makes for very smooth steering action. If you narrow the balls off, I find that it makes the car a bit more aggressive on the front end. The side stiffeners haven't changed, neither of the standoffs. The pivot balls, the mid pivot, the links, it's all the same as an E5. The tweak plate is the same. All of the pod carbon, remember, has changed, although your pod plates are the same. Although the front springs are obviously new to match the design of the new front end, the side springs and the rear spring come from the same family. So and we'll be using the same values as we did before. I'm going to start out with the kit sides and the kit rear. So that's the E6, and I look forward to running it at Chesterfield. And if you've got any comments, really welcome them, pop them in below, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.